To introduce the keynote speaker, I invite Her Excellency, President Ekaterina Filova, of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers and Specialist Prosecutor's Office to the stage. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very humbled to be here today on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. My deep gratitude goes to the Ambassador of Israel, Mr. Naor Gilon, for having invited me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Mr. Professor Philippe Sands. I also thank the Israeli Embassy, the municipality of The Hague, and the Jewish Cultural Organization, Hague, for having organized today's commemoration event. Today we gather to solemnly remember the horrific atrocities committed during the Holocaust, when humanity lost its way. We gather to pay tribute to the 6 million Jews and millions of others murdered by the Nazis. We gather to remember the generations that were lost. We gather in the hope that future generations will never forget. We will continue to pause on this day to reflect on the importance of a just and peaceful society, a society where the rule of law prevails and where those sacred words mean and continue to mean never again. I learned from my history, from my people, that sometimes you have to do more than just survive. You have to take a stand for what is right. I was born in Bulgaria. Make no mistake, my country joined the Axis powers during the war. But my people, the people of Bulgaria, understood and valued the principles of humanity. They understood that sometimes you must put pressure on your government to protect your fellow citizens. And where you do not trust that your government will do so, you must at times lay your body over the train tracks to save your friends, your neighbors, your countrymen from death camps, because it is right. This is what happened in Bulgaria. Our people pressured Parliament to enact a law prohibiting the deportation of more than 50,000 Jews to the concentration camps. Fearing that the government would ignore the law, Bulgarian citizens went to the stations on the anticipated day of deportations, ready to lay down on the tracks. The trains did not depart because the Bulgarian people knew you must protect those at risk. You must hold on to the principles of humanity. This part of history may have been forgotten by some, but it has been not forgotten by me, and it has driven me throughout my life and in my work dedicated to justice. So too has Mr. Philippe Sands been driven throughout all his life. Mr. Sands has worked tirelessly throughout his prolific career as a writer, a leading human rights lawyer, a professor of law, a member of various boards and commissions to ensure that those most responsible for the commission of heinous crimes are held accountable, to ensure that unknown stories are told, to ensure that we never forget. Indeed, Mr. Sands' ability, whether through his advocacy or through his writing, to illuminate aspects of history, to uncover facts, and to tell a story from a human perspective is uncanny. It is Mr. Sands' insatiable curiosity and determination that led him to uncover the threads that bond two renowned legal scholars, Hersch Lauterpecht and Raphael Lemkin, in his beautifully evocative book, East-West Street. It tells the story of two men who are lions of international law. It tells the story of the birth of legal concepts, the very existence of which we have never questioned. His exploitation of the life of these men in the context of the search for his own roots is a true recounting of history that matters in particular in our field. We take for granted today a world order that was built from the ashes of Holocaust, the United Nations, the European Union, our common humanity. We take for granted that the very notions about which Mr. Sands has so eloquently written, the notions upon which we now rely to hold accountable those most responsible for heinous crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. As we stand here today, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, the Holocaust is gradually passing out of living memory and into history. The increased distance from these events makes Mr. Sands' work all the more important and valuable. During a time when states are turning inward, where world leaders are questioning the very need for international institutions that were created to prevent another Holocaust, our collective voices must be heard. We must not give away the very foundations upon which our liberties were built. As Mr. Sands has demonstrated throughout his distinguished, spectacular career, we cannot be complacent, nor can we be pessimistic about the future of our world order. It is incumbent upon each of us to remember what happened during the Holocaust. We must continue to move the world, as imperfect as it is, to justice, to adhere to the rule of law, to care for our collective humanity, and to lay down on the train tracks if needed. Indeed, in East-West Street, if East-West Street makes one thing clear, it is the influence that individuals can have on the course of history. To quote Elie Wiesel, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Mr. Sands has never failed to stand up. He has never failed to protest. I'm honored to introduce a man that has made the history of the luminaries of international criminal justice so lucidly present in his prose, a man who stands for what is right and stands by his words. With immense pleasure and respect, I now pass the floor to my distinguished colleague, Professor, Queen's Counsel, Philippe Sands.
Thank you so much, Judge Trendafilova, for that incredibly generous introduction. I appreciate it hugely. Mayor, Excellencies, Presidents, Judges, Ambassadors, Registrars, Secretary Generals, Rabbis, ladies and gentlemen, students, friends, everyone gathered here today. It is truly a privilege for me to be with you on this day, in this incredibly special place for me, the Peace Palace, to mark together the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz extermination camp and everything that moment stands for. In this way, and in particular in this place, the home of the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, we signal our continuing commitment to mark the Holocaust and all the terrible events of that period and all the terrible events that have occurred subsequently. We are here together as a group, but of course each of us is also an individual. And I long ago came to understand that the activities of any person, in my case teaching, writing, litigating here in The Hague, is informed by our background. None of us arrives in the world as an entirely blank slate. In his fine autobiography, Interesting Times, the historian Eric Hobsbawm recognized that complex connection between who we are and what we do. He noted the profound way in which the interweaving of a person's life and times and the observation of both help to shape and to help us understand history. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer, and I focus on matters international. My professional and academic interest is a desire to understand how the law works, how rules come into being, how they are interpreted and applied, how they affect behavior. My curiosity about a person's life and times concerns the way it might inform the world, and, as the judge has just said, my experience of the past quarter of a century in my work, not least in the courtroom opposite, points to a very clear conclusion. Individual lives, memory, and personal histories really matter, and they really can make a difference. East-West Street took nearly 7 years to write. It's not about the life of one person, but of four. I suppose, in a sense, it seeks to understand how, in the context of the Holocaust, the particular circumstances of each man contributed to the road he took, and how the different roads they travelled changed the system of international rules that is the daily work of so many of us in this room. But of course, as some of you will know, the book also touches a more personal theme, how these four interweaving lives influenced my own path. And in doing that, it tracks some pretty big questions of identity, questions that touch each and every one of us in this room. Who am I? How do I wish to be defined? As an individual, as a member of a group, as a member of several groups? How do I want the law to protect me? As an individual or as a member of a group? Those questions are as pertinent today as they were when the legal concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide were coined back in 1945. East-West Street is an accident. In the spring of 2010, I was immersed in my world, classrooms at University College London, academic articles, cases here in The Hague. An invitation arrived from Ukraine, an email from the law faculty of the university in a city called Lemberg during the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, and then Lvov during the Polish years until 1939, and then Lviv after 1945. Would I care to visit and deliver a public lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide, about the cases in which I had been involved, my academic work, the Nuremberg trial, and its consequences for our modern world? Yes, I replied, I would love to. I'd long been fascinated by the myths of Nuremberg, the words, the images, the sounds. I was mesmerized by tiny points of detail in the transcript, the grim evidence, the books, the memoirs, the diaries, the testimony, the judges, the love affairs that went on behind the scenes. I adored the film Judgment at Nuremberg, which many of you will know, won an Oscar in 1961, probably for two moments. Spencer Tracy's unexpected flirtation with Marlene Dietrich, and the simplicity of a single line he gives in the closing judgment. He said, "We stand for truth, justice, and the value of a single human life." The Nuremberg judgment indeed blew a powerful wind into the sails of a germinal human rights movement. Sure, there was a strong smell of victor's justice, but the case was absolutely catalytic. For the first time in human history, the leaders of a country could be put on trial before an international tribunal. And that opened a door that led to The Hague. It's probably my work as a barrister rather than my writings that caused the invitation to arrive from Lviv. In the summer of 1998, I was peripherally involved in the negotiations in Rome that led to the creation of the Statute of the International Criminal Court, also here in The Hague, which of course would have jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity. The essential difference between the two concepts is on who is protected and why. If 3,000 people are systematically murdered, or even 60, it will invariably be a crime against humanity. But will it be a genocide? That depends on the intentions of the killers and the ability of a prosecutor or a court to establish that intent. To establish genocidal intent, you have to prove that the act of killing is motivated by a special intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. The two crimes operate side by side and they overlap. Every genocide is also going to be a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity will be a genocide. A few months after both crimes were inscribed into the Statute of the International Criminal Court, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on charges, interestingly enough, both of genocide and crimes against humanity, laid against him by a Spanish prosecutor. The House of Lords ruled that even as a former president of Chile, he was not entitled to claim immunity from the English courts. This was novel, a wholly revolutionary judgment. And in the years that followed, the gates of international justice slowly creaked open after 5 decades of relative quiet during the Cold War. Cases from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda soon landed on my desk, and others followed relating to allegations in the Congo, Libya, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Guantanamo, Iraq. The list goes on and on. But they were all based on the new rules that came into being in 1945, that revolutionary moment which recognized that the right of the sovereign over its people was not unlimited. I became involved in too many cases of mass killing. I have seen too many mass graves. Some of the cases raised claims of crimes against humanity, the killing of individuals on a large scale. Others gave rise to allegations of genocide, the destruction of groups. These two distinct crimes, with their different emphases on the individual and the group, grew side by side, and over time it seems that genocide seems to have emerged as the crime of crimes, an unhappy hierarchy, one that leaves a suggestion that somehow the killing of a large number of individuals is less terrible. Occasionally I'd pick up hints about the origins and purposes of the two terms and the connections to arguments first made in Nuremberg's Courtroom 600, but I never really inquired what had happened in that courtroom. I didn't know about the personal stories behind the trial, and the invitation from Lviv gave me a chance to explore that. Now, I could tell you that I made the trip to give a lecture, but that would not be true. I made the trip because of this young fellow who is my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, who was born in Lemberg in 1904. He called it Lemberg when he spoke in German, Lwów when he spoke in Polish. And in his wonderful slim volume, Mój Lwów, My Lviv, My Lemberg, published in 1946, the fabulous Polish poet Józef Witlin describes the essence of being a Lwovian. It is, he wrote, an extraordinary mix of nobility and roguery, of wisdom and imbecility, of poetry and vulgarity. But, Witlin continued, nostalgia always likes to falsify the flavors, and it tells us to taste nothing but the sweetness of Lwów today. I know people, Witlin concludes, for whom Lwów was a cup of gall. It was a cup of gall for many people in this room, and it was for my grandfather, Leon. He buried it deep in a hinterland of which he never once spoke to me or my brother. His silence barely covered the wounds of a family he left in 1914 when the Russians invaded Lemberg and moved to Vienna, and then lost forever after 1939 when he fled Vienna for Paris. Yet the first moment I set foot in the city in October 2010, it felt incredibly familiar. It was like meeting a long-lost relative. Why I had that reaction and what caused me to explore, why I had that reaction caused me to explore writings on the relationship between grandparent and grandchild. And I was directed in particular to the work of Maria Torok and Nicholas Abraham, two Hungarian psychoanalysts. What haunts, they wrote, are the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. And these are the words with which the book opens. My grandfather's secret was that he came from a huge family, centered in Lemberg and its environs. Literally dozens of uncles, aunts, cousins, nephews, distant relatives. The family grew and grew until war came in 1939. By the spring of 1945, alive in Paris, he was the only member of that family in Galicia to have survived. Indeed, in preparing the lecture that I was to give in Lviv, my mother for the first time gave me access to his private papers. And amongst it, I actually found, remarkably, the expulsion order from November 1938. Translated into English, it says, and this marks the words of President Yusuf, "The Jew, Buchholz, Morris, Leon, shall leave the territory of the German Reich by December the 25th, 1938. He was expelled because by then he had been made stateless, one of the reasons I am so opposed of the renaissance today of some countries, including one of my own, to make people stateless. This is how it begins. I had always assumed that Leon had left Vienna with his wife Rita, my grandmother, and his one-year-old daughter, their one-year-old daughter, Ruth, my mother. But in having access to these papers, I learned for the first time that this was not the case, that my grandfather left by himself, that his daughter traveled to Paris a few months later, and that his wife remained in Vienna for another 3 years. It seems that something else had intervened in their lives to cause the separation of the family. Why did my grandfather Leon leave Vienna by himself? How on earth did my mother Ruth get to Paris by herself, aged 1? And why did Rita stay in Vienna, allowing herself to be separated from her only child? These are huge questions. I found a load more documents in my grandfather's papers, hunting for clues. I'm a litigator, which is a sort of lesser amateur historian come psychiatrist. And being a litigator, as many of you in this room will know, means that you learn that every scrap of paper, every photograph, is capable of having multiple meanings and hiding information that is not immediately knowable. It's the muck of evidence, and I love it, and lots of people in this room love it. We learn to look carefully, always keep an open mind, attend to the unexpected, find the dots, try to join them, and persist, because nothing is ever only what it seems. 2 items stood out. The first was actually a tiny scrap of thin yellow paper, 2 centimeters by 3 centimeters, folded in half. One side was blank, the other bore the name and address, which you can see written in a firm hand in pencil. Strong, angular writing, Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. The second item was this equally tiny photograph, black and white, taken in 1949. It shows a middle-aged man staring intently into the camera. He bears a faint smile across his lips. He wears a pinstripe suit. White handkerchief is folded neatly into the breast pocket, and he's got a sort of mischievous polka dot bow tie. On the back of the photograph, in blue ink, is written, Herzliche Grüße aus Wien, September 1949. Warmest wishes from Vienna, and there is a signature, firm, but to me, totally indecipherable. I asked my mother who Miss Tilney was, and who is this man in the bow tie. She said she didn't know. I didn't believe her. I pinned the scraps on the wall above my desk and turned to write the lecture for Lviv. I've taken you off on a personal detour, but let's go back to the lecture that I had to write, and the first of several coincidences that I encountered. I was immensely surprised to learn that summer that the man who put the words crimes against humanity into international law was actually a student at Lviv University, which had invited me, but the people who had invited me did not know that fact. His name, very familiar in The Hague, he was a judge for several years here in the Peace Palace, was Hirsch Lauterpacht. He was born actually in the small town of Zhulkiev, about 15 miles north of Lviv. He enrolled at the Lviv University Law Faculty. In 1919, he moved to Vienna, where he became a doctoral student of Hans Kelsen. He spent 4 years there, got his doctorate, moved to London in the company of a wife. He became a renowned academic in Britain, first at the LSE, then at Cambridge University. In 1945, he published the book that would lay the foundations for our modern system of human rights. He gave it the title, An International Bill of the Rights of Man, and it offered a simple new idea: to recognize that every human being had rights under international law because he or she was an individual human being. He prepared a draft convention, one that gave effect to his revolutionary credo: the individual human being is the ultimate unit of all law, including international law. In April 1945, as the war in Europe ended, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed that senior Nazi leaders would be put on trial. The British hired Lauterpacht to assist in the prosecution, to work with Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor. Jackson travelled to London to draft the tribunal charter. As the four powers, the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, disagreed about the crimes over which the tribunal would exercise jurisdiction, Jackson was driven to Cambridge to meet with his old acquaintance, Hirsch Lauterpacht. They have tea in Lauterpacht's garden. Here you see Lauterpacht in his garden on Cranmer Road. The two men discuss the problem of crimes. It is Lauterpacht who suggests that it would be a good idea to insert titles into the Nuremberg Charter. That will help public understanding, and more public understanding means more public legitimacy. Jackson is positive. And so Lauterpacht offers another idea on atrocities against civilians, on which the Soviets and the Americans are deeply divided. Lauterpacht has a long-standing academic interest in the subject and, of course, a deeply personal interest. He still has, at this point, the summer of 45, no news about what has happened to his family in Lemberg. It is a matter about which, as a new Englishman, he says nothing to Jackson. Why not, he says, why not refer to atrocities against civilians as crimes against humanity? And here you see the words in Lauterpacht's own hand. The term will cover massive atrocities against individuals, torture, murder, disappearance, and introduce a new concept into international law. Jackson likes the idea, takes it back to London, and a few days later it is incorporated as Article 6, Paragraph C of the Nuremberg Charter. Clearly an innovation, Lauterpacht tells the Foreign Office, but necessary to stop those who break international law from hiding behind the law of their own state. Preparing the lecture required me also to focus on genocide, which brings me to the second surprise. The man who invented that word also passed through the Lviv and amazingly studied at the same law school as Lauterpacht, not quite at the same time, and again, those who invited me were clueless as to this fact. His name was Raphael Lemkin. He arrived at Lviv in 1921, 2 years after Lauterpacht had left, and remained there until 1926, when he obtained a doctorate in criminal law. He became a public prosecutor in Warsaw, and in 1933, for a League of Nations meeting, it was his idea to propose new international crimes, which he called combating barbarity and vandalism against people. But unlike Lauterpacht, his focus was on the protection of groups, not individuals. The timing was not ideal. Hitler had just taken power in Germany. 6 years later, in 1939, by now a private lawyer, when Germany invades Poland, Lemkin escapes from Warsaw to live in Sweden. And from there, he makes his way to Durham, North Carolina, where he's been offered a place of academic refuge at Duke University. He travels with little money, no personal belongings, but a vast quantity of suitcases. Each one is filled with scraps of paper, for he has spent his time in Sweden collecting all the decrees promulgated by the Nazis in occupied countries across Europe. He's gathered this material, he carts it 3/4 of the way around the world, and in Duke University he starts analysing it. He's given a book contract, and in November 1944 he publishes a book with the title Axis Rule of Occupied Europe, which examines the Nazi actions. To Chapter 9 he gives the title this word, genocide. He has literally invented it to describe the destruction of groups. It is an amalgam of the Greek word genos, meaning tribe or race, and the Latin word side. This is the word in his own hand in 1945. In the summer of 45, Lemkin too is hired to work on the Nuremberg trial, but by the Americans. He too works with Jackson, but separately from Lauterpacht. He wants the senior Nazis to be indicted for genocide, for the destruction of groups, and is hugely disappointed when the Nuremberg Charter includes crimes against humanity, but makes no mention of genocide or the destruction of groups. He flies to London to draft the indictment that will follow the Charter, the indictment of the defendants, and is persistent. There's huge opposition to the term genocide from Robert Jackson's office, under pressure from southern US senators who worry that it's going to be used by African Americans, and the British are opposed to it because they worry about the legacy of colonialism. But against all the odds, Lemkin's word makes it into the indictment as a war crime, a category to include ill treatment and murder of civilians in occupied territories, including Lemberg and Volkovisk, where his parents lived, although like Lauterpacht at this point he has no news about the fate of his family. This will be the first time ever that the word is used in an international legal instrument with Lemkin's definition, the extermination of racial and religious groups, and Lemkin identifies Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. The trial opens on November the 20th, 1945. Lauterpacht is present in the courtroom with the British team pushing for the protection of individuals. Lemkin remains, for the moment, in Washington, pushing for the protection of groups from a distance. One of the 22 men in the dock is this gentleman, Hans Frank, who is the fourth character in East-West Street. Like Lauterpacht and Lemkin, he was a lawyer, and he worked personally for Adolf Hitler from 1928 to 1933. He was then appointed Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland in October 1939. 3 years later, Frank visited Lemberg and the district of Galicia, newly conquered. He stayed in the home of his deputy, Otto Wächter, and Wächter's wife, Charlotte, who I would discover from Charlotte's diaries, was in love with Frank. Frank hosted a concert, Fidelio, the opening overture, and Beethoven's Ninth, and gave a series of speeches in which he announced the elimination of 500,000 people in the city of Lemberg and the surrounding area of District Galicia. And amongst those who will be caught up in the horrors that follow Frank's visit are the families, friends, and teachers of Lauterpacht and Lemkin and my grandfather's family and your father's family. For each of these families, there will be only a single survivor. 3 years later, in May 1945, Frank is caught by the US Army. near his home in southern Bavaria, just south of Munich. He has with him his diaries, 42 volumes, and a fantastic collection of artwork. And when I say fantastic, I mean fantastic. It includes this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, which many of you will have seen, Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with an ermine, painted in about 1489. Frank appropriated the painting from a local owner and museum and took it to his private offices in the Wawel Castle in Krakow, where, I'm pleased to say, it hangs again today. Frank's son Nicholas tells me that as a young boy, his father made him stand before this painting in the morning and slick down his hair like Cecilia Gallerani, and the little boy, aged 5, was frightened of what he thought was a large rat. An ermine, I told Nicholas. And now Frank was in the dock in Courtroom 600, charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. On the first day of the trial, the Soviet prosecutors take the judges to the terrible events in Lemberg that followed Frank's visit. They are in the transcript. They describe the murder of 130,000 human beings in just a few months, Jews and Poles, including 8,000 children in the heart of the city. As these words are spoken in court, Lauterpacht and Lemkin do not know whether the victims include their own family members. Nor are they aware, and this touches me as someone who spends time in court, that the man they are directly prosecuting, Hans Frank, has been directly implicated in the unknown fate of their own families. And on this day, for the first time in history, the terms genocide and crimes against humanity are spoken in an open court. I knew Lauterpacht and Frank to be in Courtroom 600 at some point in the trial, and I wondered if there was a photograph of that. Lauterpacht's son, Ellie, who will be known to some of you in this room, told me there was no photograph. But like my mother, I didn't believe him. I persisted, and eventually, in an obscure archive in London, I found what it was that I was looking for, the Nuremberg Courtroom on the opening day of the trial from an unusual angle. In the top left-hand corner, at the British table, you can see Lauterpacht. Hands clenched, he's listening to a Soviet prosecutor, perhaps talking about what happened in Lemberg. And if you move your eyes to the lower right-hand corner, you will see Hermann Goering in his familiar, oversized, large, light-colored suit. And then, 6 to his left, Hans Frank, his head semi-bowed, divided by no more than a few tables and chairs. Lauterpacht and Frank are together in the same room, an image that I have to say still touches me deeply. The trial lasts for a full year, and judgment is handed down on September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946. I don't have time to address what transpired over the course of a remarkable year as the lives of the three men became increasingly intertwined. The historian and writer Anthony Beevor describes the account as being of a kind that no novel could ever possibly match. Life as a form of literature, it could be said, and more. The simple point that I make is that personal journeys coincided. They changed the course of legal history. They changed history itself. The words and ideas of Lemkin and Lauterpacht, of course, having served here as a judge in 1951 and sitting in the case sitting just after the case that President Yusuf referred to, influenced politics, history, culture, my life, and each of your lives. The concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide have not existed since time immemorial, as many imagine. They are the product of the creative, inventive minds of two men, experience forged on the anvil of a single city. Why Lauterpacht opted for the protection of individuals and what caused Lemkin to embrace the protection of groups is a matter of speculation. Their backgrounds were similar. They studied at the same university. They studied with the same teachers. You can trace the origins of these crimes to the city of Lemberg, Lviv, in the period after the Great War, to the law faculty, to a single teacher the two men had in common, Julius Makarewicz, a Polish professor of criminal law. And you can even follow the line to a single building in the university still today, a working classroom, as you can see, where Julius Makarewicz taught. Curiously, despite the common origins of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, the common interests and journeys, and the fact that I could on some occasion locate them in the same city on the same day, although never Nuremberg and not Courtroom 600, where they missed each other on two occasions by just a single day, it seems that Lauterpacht and Lemkin never actually met. But their ideas form the working life of so many of us in this room. And I've frequently wondered how it could be that I ended up doing the work that I do, and how it was me who somehow stumbled across their stories. My quest was surely driven by a personal history, by a legacy of memory and stories buried deep in a crypt of family secrets occasioned by the thing we call the Holocaust. The journey that I took included a great deal more detective work. I discovered who Miss Tilney was and what she did, and have come to understand why my mother and I and my brother have reason to be grateful to a woman of extraordinary courage, an evangelical Christian missionary at the Surrey Chapel in Norwich, who was motivated by the sermons of her pastor. I am before you here today because of her interpretation of a single line from chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans. That is what prompted her to travel to Vienna and bring a 1-year-old infant from Vienna to Paris and save her life in the summer of 1939. That is my mother. I also uncovered the identity of the man in the bow tie, and that journey was more complicated. First, I headed east and then west, across rivers and an ocean, and then, with the help of a pile of ancient Austrian telephone directories and the assistance of a fantastic private detective in Vienna, I'm very sorry to say I worked out who the man in the bow tie was with Facebook. With Facebook, I ended up in an attic in Massapequa, Long Island, from which there emerged in New York State this photograph, the key to unlocking another family mystery. A single image taken in a garden in Vienna, in Bramsplatz, in the spring of 1941, my grandmother with two gentlemen in white socks, one of whom, as you will recognize, was the man in the bow tie, and he was her secret lover. One discovery catalyzed another, the identity in particular of the person who seems to have been my grandfather's truest love, his best friend, Max. The effort took years and involved the assistance of a range of remarkable individuals in Austria, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Germany, to whom I am immensely grateful. These are the requirements of an exercise in personal archaeological enterprise. But perhaps even more remarkably, and entirely unexpectedly, I learned of the more direct connections between my family and the Lauterpachts and the Lemkins. I was hugely surprised to learn that my great-grandmother, Amalia Buchholz, was actually born and lived in the small town of Żółkiew. And those of you who've been specially attentive will know that happens to be the town where Hirsch Lauterpacht was born. It gets even better. Both were born and lived on the very same street, Lemberger Straße, just a few hundred meters apart. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, Lauterpacht's son and only child, Ellie, was my first teacher of international law in 1982. It was he who said to me, become an international lawyer, and if you're lucky, you'll get to plead at the International Court of Justice. We worked together for 33 years before we discovered our connection to Lemberger Straße. only after 33 years did we learn of our connection to a street that the great Austrian writer Joseph Roth called East-West Street. And then I learned that Amalia, whose life began on this street, the street of the Lauterpacks, she ended her life in September 1942, on the 23rd to be very precise, in the kingdom of Hans Frank. For the last street that she walked down was Himmelfahrtstraße, the street to heaven, the street that led from a railway platform to the gas chamber at Treblinka. And 1 month later, Lemkin's parents, Bella and Joseph, walked down the same street and perished in the same gas chamber. Amalia's life was caught in this curious way between the Lauterpacks and the Lemkins, in a terrible way, as it might be said is mine, albeit in a wholly different way. How does one begin to understand these points of connection? The starting point is surely the ideas of Lauterpact and Lemkin and their enduring relevance today. The relationship between the individual and the group has been contested across the ages. Lauterpact believed passionately that we must concentrate on the protection of the individual. And I think he would still argue today that Lemkin's invention of the concept of genocide has been useless in practical terms and that it is politically dangerous because it will tend to replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group. And I have to say that in my own practical experience, that view concords. I've seen for myself in working cases before various courts in this city that by focusing on the protection of one group against another, there is a tendency to reinforce the sense of them and us, to amplify the power of group identity and association, to reinforce the sense of victimhood of the targeted group and hatred towards the perpetrators as a group. That's the problem with genocide. But I also understand clearly what Lemkin was trying to do. And he was surely right to recognize the reality that in most, if not all cases, mass atrocity is targeted not against individuals, as President Yusuf pointed out, but against people who happen to be a member of a group that is hated at a particular time and place. Lemkin would say, and it is a powerful argument, that the law must reflect that reality, that it must also recognize and give legitimacy to feelings that probably all of us have of kinship and association with one or more groups. But I remain concerned about hierarchy, one that puts genocide atop the list of horrors. Call something a genocide and it'll be on page 1 of our newspapers. Call it a crime against humanity, and if it's in a newspaper at all, it'll be on page 13. That's the power of the word invented by Lemkin. So what is the enduring legacy of these two legal terms? Last week in Washington, I discussed this on a panel with Tom Bergenthal, wonderful Tom Bergenthal, who was a small boy in Auschwitz under the care, it could be said, of a man called Joseph Mengele. He later served in that building as a judge of the International Court of Justice. And we wondered how it could be that on the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the poison of xenophobia and nationalism and populism was once again coursing its way through the veins of Europe and many other parts of the world. How could the strong man as leader be back? I've seen it for myself on journeys to central and eastern parts of our European continent. Those of you who've seen the film that accompanied the book, the BBC Storyville film, My Nazi Legacy, will have seen me standing in a faraway field watching people dressed in SS uniforms celebrating the creation of Otto Wächter's Waffen-SS Galicia division. I've seen it too on the journeys in writing my new book, The Rat Line, which you can listen to already as a BBC podcast series. Travelling across Europe, it's hard to avoid what seems to be stirring and wondering to where this will lead. The generation that experienced the horrors of the 1930s, that lived through the Second World War, that knows why states came together after 1945 to create a United Nations and the idea of human rights, to adopt a universal declaration and a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide, that generation will soon be gone. Perhaps it is the disappearance of actual memory, of actual experience, that allows our political leaders to take for granted the remarkable thing that happened in 1945. It is impossible for me not to have gone through the experience of writing East-West Street, an immersion in the world of the years between 1914 and 1945, and not feel an acute sense of anxiety as to what is stirring today. Not so long ago, the one who's now the President of the United States called for a total and complete shutdown for all Muslims entering the United States. The idea of targeting people not because of what they've done, not because of their individual actions, but because they happen to be a member of a particular group, has a long and dark history. The writer Primo Levi put it best in the preface to his book, If This Is a Man, published in 1947, after he'd been out of Auschwitz for a couple of years. He wrote, "Many people, many nations can find themselves holding more or less wittingly that every stranger is an enemy. When this happens, when the unspoken dogma becomes the major premise in a syllogism, then, at the end of the chain, there is the concentration camp. One thing leads to another, always, when you start to single out people, not for what they might have done, but because they happen to be a member of a particular group. Or, perhaps in the eyes of some, if you feel yourself to be a citizen of the world, as the ambassador does." 4 years ago, the then British Prime Minister told her party conference, and I quote, "If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere." It seems she was blissfully unaware of the implications of what she was really saying. Her words reminded me of a passage from Stefan Zweig's magnificent book, The World of Yesterday. If you read anything now for what we are going through, read Zweig. Read that book. It was published posthumously in 1942 after Zweig had committed suicide in Brazil. "For almost half a century," Zweig wrote, "I trained my heart to beat as the heart of a citizen of the world. On the day I lost my Austrian passport, I discovered that when you lose your native land, you lose more than a patch of territory set within borders." One thing leads to another, across time and place. Today, we are again at a dangerous moment. Many of our politicians seem not to be able to recognize how precious was the settlement of 1945 and how vulnerable is the acquis that was created, one that has offered a foundation to international relations in our time. We cannot take for granted what was achieved back then. The threat to the multilateral global order, to the rights of individuals and groups, to the idea of the rule of law is very real. That the current retreat from that remarkable 1945 moment, initiated by the Atlantic Charter, signed by Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt in August 1941, that retreat should now be led by the two countries that put the system in place is tremendously troubling. Who would have thought, on the day the Nuremberg trial opened on the 20th of November 1945, that 75 years later, the rule of law flame would be carried by the country whose nationals sat in the dock, rather than those who prosecuted. But there are positive developments. Efforts are underway, led by the United Nations International Law Commission, under the direction of my dear friend Professor Sean Murphy, to prepare a new convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, to fill a much-needed gap alongside the Genocide Convention. That initiative deserves universal support. And there is, too, new thinking on how we can better enforce that which we already have. Tomorrow, here in The Hague, they will open further diplomatic discussions on a possible new multilateral treaty for mutual legal assistance and extradition for the most serious international crimes. And of course, as mentioned, just last week, the International Court of Justice handed down a far-reaching, some would say momentous, provisional measures order in a case concerning the protection of a Rohingya group in Myanmar, Muslims in Rakhine State, an order to safeguard, as the court put it, the fundamental values sought to be protected by the Genocide Convention. It's not just that the court ordered clear provisional measures, or that for the first time it ordered measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of genocidal acts, or that for the first time it gave far-reaching reporting requirements on all the measures taken to give effect to its order. Most strikingly of all, most remarkably, the court spoke with a single voice. All the judges spoke together without a single dissent. 17 distinct individuals, one group, one court. And so we go on, looking back, moving forward. The sequel to East-West Street will be published shortly. It tells the story of this couple, Otto and Charlotte Wächter, and my close relationship with their son, Horst Arthur Wächter. This perhaps is addressed to the mayor, because Horst Arthur Wächter's godfather was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a man who is very well known to this country and whose actions contributed directly to the events we commemorate today and to the 6 individuals for whom candles have been lit. Seyss-Inquart served as Reichskommissar of the Netherlands from May 1940 until the end of the war. He was hanged at Nuremberg with Hans Frank for the crimes against humanity he committed and directed from his office in the Binnenhof, so close to where we are today. Seyss-Inquart's deputy, Hans Fischberg, a close friend of the Wächters, got away and made it to Argentina, where he became Juan Fischberg. The Rat Line, the name of the book, is a tale of love and lies and justice, and it's one that takes us into the next phase, into the Cold War period. Otto Wächter, seen here smiling, is the man who ordered the construction of the Krakow ghetto and the Lemberg ghetto. He later served as governor of Galicia in Lemberg. On 9th of May 1945, he disappeared off the face of the earth, indicted for mass murder. For 3 years, he hid in the Austrian Alps. In this image, you see him with his wife secretly on his way to Italy in late 1948, assisted by a most unlikely coalition of willing helpers. In April 1949, he reached Rome, where he was protected by an Austrian bishop and elements in and around the Vatican. Believing himself to be a hunted man, he gathered the documents necessary to make his way along the Rat Line to safety in Argentina, but he never made it. He had spent a weekend near Castel Gandolfo and had swum in Lake Albano with an old comrade whom he never mentioned by name. He died unexpectedly in the Santo Spiritu Hospital, a stone's throw from St. Peter's. For the past 10 years, his son, Horst Arthur, has sought to persuade me that his father was essentially a decent and good man. I have explored in the meantime the crimes committed by Horst Arthur's father and sought to understand how can it be that a highly intelligent, educated, and prosperous couple could become embroiled in the horrors with which they became embroiled. In writing about the Wächters, I continue to oscillate between the views of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, between the individual and the group, between the realism of Lemkin and the idealism of Lauterpacht. I can see the force of both their arguments, and I can recognize the tension and the struggle between the individual and the group, between crimes against humanity and genocide. It's not a tension that will soon be resolved, and so international law today embraces both concepts. And yet, on this most important and solemn of days, I think it is impossible for me not to end except where East-West Street ends, in a wood just a kilometre from the centre of Żółkiew, at an unmarked site of mass killing. I came across it entirely unexpectedly, a conversation with a lady called Ludmila Bybula, who worked for the local municipality, a wonderful Ukrainian lady. She told me about it, and she accompanied me there. "We have arrived." She spoke the words quietly. Here were the ponds, 2 great sand pits filled with an expanse of dark water, mud and reeds that bent in the wind, a site marked by a single white stone, erected not by the town in expression of grief or regret, but as a private act of remembrance. There we sat, Ludmilla and I, on grass, watching the sun fall into the dark, still water that stretched tight across the openings of the earth. Deep down, untouched for more than half a century, lay the remains of the 3,500 people of whom the long-forgotten Gershon Taffet wrote in the summer of 1946. Individuals each, together a group. Among the bones that there lay beneath was a commingling of my grandfather Leon's uncle Libus, of Hirsch Lauterpacht's uncle David, resting near each other in this place just because they happened to be a member of the wrong group at the wrong time in the wrong place. The sun warmed the water. The trees lifted me upward and away from the reeds towards an indigo sky, and right there, for a brief moment, I understood. On this special day of memory, in this most special of cities and places, I thank you for your kind attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the conclusion of tonight's gathering. Professor Sands, while reading your book, East-West Street, I couldn't help but notice a curious commonality amongst the heroes of your story. You start with your grandfather, who you affectionately call Leo. You follow him to Lemberg, Lviv, where you introduce us to the great scholars Lauterpacht and Lemkin. Did it ever occur to you that all these names start with the letter L? The letter L, or the Hebrew letter Lamed, stands for learning the lessons. And that's what commemoration is all about. Zechor Yemot Olam, Binu Shnot Dor Vador. Remember the days of old, reflect upon the years of all generations. Professor Sands says he's not a historian, but he preserves memory. He actually recalls memories which weren't passed on to him. His story is someone else's story. Memory is your own. Professor Sands definitely made it his own, and we should do the same. Honored judges, learned professors, and dear listeners, when we contemplate the impact of the Holocaust on the development of international law, we must realize that laws on their own will not prevent horrific crimes from happening. Young people must be educated to live a life with purpose. Right now, we're witnessing what's called the rise of anti-Semitism, or some would call it the new anti-Semitism. And this is an issue that should concern any civilized member of society. It's not a Jewish issue, and if I may interject, it's also not an issue that we can leave to politicians. It's something that society has to address. The Jewish people have often been the first targets of discrimination, but nevertheless, one who fails to respect and recognize the value of another's life has no true appreciation of his own life. As President Yusuf pointed out, it's not only a defamation of the other's life, it's your own life. One who recognizes his or her true intrinsic value, being a human being created in the divine image, will also appreciate and respect the intrinsic value of his or her fellow, even one who looks, acts, or speaks differently. More than just teaching laws and conventions and treaties, parents, teachers, schools, universities, and society as a whole must instill in youth a consciousness and awareness of life that is larger than oneself. An infinite purpose which makes every single life immeasurably valuable. President Tranafilova pointed to the heroes who stopped the train. Did they stop the Holocaust? No. They saved a life, and they saved their face. I would like to thank the board of Chai and the fantastic team of volunteers, the staff of the Embassy of Israel, the municipality of The Hague, and the staff of the Peace Palace for organizing and hosting this memorial. I'd like to thank all present who made the effort to come, pay respect, and hopefully learn in honor of the victims. Special thanks to the young people here tonight who carry the flame from the past to the future. To the contributors in tonight's program, for the courage to speak up, for the wisdom and insights for us to reflect upon, for allowing us to experience your feelings and inspirations. Mayor Remkes, President Youssef, Mr. Schnei, Ambassador Gilon, Mrs. Anne Dunkelgruen, President Tenafilova, and of course, our guest lecturer, Professor Sands. They deserve an applause. You're all invited to join us for a reception in the foyer, speak with each other, exchange thoughts and ideas while enjoying a snack and a drink. Everything being served is kosher. Good night, and may the memory of the deceased bring blessings upon us and all good people. Good night.